please help me welcome RRTC's Director of Program Development, Piers Kaniuka.
Hi everybody, my name is Piers Kaniuka. Eddie didn't tell you, but I'm an old war horse in the field. So, you know, I got clean 1995. Been in the industry for quite a while. And I've watched the industry change. And I've watched, I think some of you can probably speak to this, I've watched our clients show up in worse shape as the years go by. And a lot of that is just straight economics. Drugs are cheaper, drugs are stronger, drugs are more plentiful. But there are other factors too. COVID certainly doesn't make it any better. So, because I've been in the field for so long, I've been thinking hard about, you know, how can we improve this? How can we turn this around? What does that mean? What would that look like? And a few years ago, I had the the great pleasure of becoming introduced to the work of a guy named Dr. Bruce Alexander. And if you don't know his name, you probably know of Rat Park. So he's the guy who did the Rat Park experiment 40 years ago. If you've heard this thing that we use, we stole from him, the opposite of addiction is not abstinence, the opposite of addiction is connection. That comes from Bruce Alexander. And what his work showed, if you don't, I guess I'll just do it quickly. If you don't know how it evolved, he is the guy who looked at this experiment 40 years ago where they were putting isolated rats in cages and hanging dispensers of water and dispensers of morphine on the cage. And the rat, of course, would drink the morphine, and it would drink the morphine to the point where it passed out. It would eventually get so it preferred the morphine to food. And Alexander's a really sharp guy, and he looked at that and he said, you know what? You're just torturing the animal. Of course the animal drinks the morphine. It has nothing else to do. It's scared. And he saw this as an example of what they call bias confirmation, meaning they set up the experiment to prove what they already believed. And in this case, it was that morphine is this overwhelmingly appealing and addictive drug, right? So he tested his idea by creating this rat park. He creates this big, well-appointed cage where the rats can hide and they can play and they have toys and tunnels and treadmills and good food and other rats to interact with. And they hang the morphine and they hang the water. And what do the rats do? Anybody?
They drink the water.
They drink the water. There were rats that would hit the morphine. They were the partier rats. But even the rats that hit the morphine, they'd go hit the morphine and then they'd go back and interact with the rats. None of them got strung out. Later, he even introduced addicted rats into the cage. And much to his amazement, they didn't drink the morphine. They actually went through withdrawal. And then the most remarkable thing about all of this is he lost funding for his experiment, which was widely publicized, published. His lab was turned into a student lounge, and the whole study went up on the shelf for about 40 years. People forgot about it. But they went looking for it a little while ago. And the reason why they went looking for it was probably fentanyl. It was probably the opioid epidemic got so bad that somebody said, you know what, maybe we ought to check this out. And for the last 20 years or so, 15 years or so, people all around the world are looking at the implications of this study. And it's getting a lot of traction in Europe. So it's actually determining treatment programming and social policy in places like Portugal, Switzerland, Holland. The entire country of Thailand has adopted this very recently. It's not getting much foothold here. And that's because of certain structures in our treatment having a lot to do with insurance. And a few other things too. It's actually pretty dark. So anyway, Alexander's definition of addiction is this. any overwhelming involvement with a substance or an activity that is harmful to you or your social relations. That's a very interesting definition. Because when he says overwhelming involvement, he means time, money, and energy. The time, the money, the energy that you spend on the drug or the activity comes at the expense of your family, your kids, the community, your job. So he's talking about heroin, and he's talking about vodka, but you know what else he's talking about? I don't have it with me. He's talking about cell phones. This is my way of shaming you off your cell phone. He's talking about food. He's talking about, if you're a young man, gaming or digital pornography. He's talking about all these things that we would call process addictions, right? Because a person can get so involved with gaming or shopping or what have you that it comes at the expense of their family. And this might not sound too big to you, but think about it for a second. Think about the people you know that are civilians, the non-addicts that you know. What do you see? You see vaping, and you see handheld devices, and you see all of it. And if you really look at American society right now, you can really see that addiction is more the rule than the exception. If we include process addictions, Americans are increasingly addicted all the time. And in fact, Alexander shows that the United States of America in 2020 is the most addicted society that the world has ever seen. And we need to remember that with our clients. So this changes everything, because if you're like me, and I'm a drug addict, I started using drugs in 1974, I got a narrative from the treatment world that sounded like this. Here's Piers, and he's psychologically or genetically vulnerable, and here is heroin. And you bring those two things together, you have addiction. You haven't explained anything with that. And by calling me psychologically or genetically vulnerable, that's just a very polite way of saying I'm defective. I'm broken, I'm othered, I'm somehow different. Well, this model says, no, Piers just has better taste in drugs. And I'll take drugs over shopping any day, right? So that takes stigma off of what an addict is more than anything, because it shows that the addiction is actually flowing from the conditions of life. So I'll just paint some more pictures for you. A lot of you know that I was a co-founder of a place called the Plymouth House, and I was there from 2002 to 2011. And so that means we're hitting it pretty much OxyContin moving into heroin. That's that era. And I had a lot of these clients that you've seen, but they were different then. They were these male clients, and they were knuckleheads, and they had their hat up in their ear or their ear up in their hat, and they were gangsters, but they couldn't do dishes. But they had this kind of weird swag about being a heroin addict and all that. The clients I see now, 2020, the male clients, they show up, and they don't do that anymore. This is what their presentation looks like. Tons and tons of these, almost all men, boys, millennials. And you really look at what's going on with that. And you notice other things, like they don't have muscle tone. They've never played sports. They've never done manual labor. They have horrible social skills. So they can't look you in the eye. They can't stand up straight. They can't shake hands firmly. You know, if I don't look at you, I can't read you. You know, so right now I'm just doing something that human beings do. I'm looking at your faces. I'm gauging how interested you are. I'm trying to catch you getting on that phone. But you know, that's normal, right? But we got kids now that they can't look at you. And so what that speaks to is, well, it speaks to a few things. It's speaking to this digital culture, one, because boys especially overwhelmingly involved with gaming. And they'll sit there and they'll game for, you know, a couple hours longer than they need to pee. And a lot of those same kids were prescribed stimulants as children, or they're on the Addies now, or the crystal meth. Many of them are heavily into digital pornography. And this is lighting up the same neural pathways in the brain as cocaine and speed. So you're taking that amphetamine addiction, you're spiking the dopamine so high, and then you're adding all this digital stuff on it. And they're just sucked into it. They have no defense. Millennial men are underperforming women of the same age in every category now. So women are getting way more educated. They're beginning to make as much money. That's long overdue. Job retention is much better with women, way more in college. You really wonder how young men and women are even going to talk in the future. Romance, if you haven't noticed it, is dead. Romance is like some quaint artifact of the past. I mean, that's really wild when you think about it. Like people getting to know each other and being kind of worried, does she like me? Does she really like me? And waiting to have sex, and it's better for that reason, right? And now we have millennial men who have rates of sexual dysfunction that we've never seen before because of digital pornography. So you see, these things are all conspiring. I'm just giving you a snapshot there, okay? I could go on and on because it's not just digital devices and putting kids on Ritalin and all that. You know, by the way, what happens if you give a laboratory rat Adderall? The nucleus accumbens, the part of the brain that regulates the production of dopamine, the part that's implicated in addiction, it shrinks almost immediately. A small nucleus accumbens in a human being corresponds with low motivation. That's the guy I just pointed out. So we're in a horrendous mess. We really are, and it is getting worse. And the treatment industry, by and large, has failed, and it has failed miserably. And it's time we face that. And the medical world has had their shot at this for over 100 years, and they've done nothing. They're in the game. It's great if somebody needs antipsychotics because they're psychotic from a crystal meth thing. It's great to treat the cirrhosis. It's great to treat the endocarditis. We need that. But in terms of treatment, let me give you a little picture of what medicine has done with addicts over the last 100 years. In the early part of the 20th century, they put us in comas. Bromide comas, which killed a lot of people, and later insulin comas. The belief was being in the coma would heal you of the addiction. Later, they gave hundreds of thousands of addicts electroconvulsive shock therapy. They also, for a period of time, gave us frontal lobotomies. You get the picture? Now they just medicate us to the gills. It's not working. And yet, we do know what works. This is the big irony of all this. So and science, it tells us, the neuroscience tells us that addiction is rooted in stress and trauma. So when people are stressed out, they seek relief. We see this in our addicts all the time, right? They get clean, they come in residential treatment, everything becomes cigarettes and boys and food and phones, and they're running around frantically trying to get relief. And everything, they do this pole vaulting over mouse turds thing. Everything's such a big deal, right? It's because they don't feel good, they're uncomfortable, they don't have the drugs anymore, right? And of course, we have to get their attention in that, and that's really hard to do. But what we know is, if they're all stressed out, and they can't get their drugs, so they can't get relief, now their problems are probably crashing down on them, the bills are coming in, if you will. If you can get them relaxed, if you can give them some relief from that stress, you can begin to work with them. And we know how to do that, okay? And it's all studied and validated and confirmed. And it's things like meditation, yoga, qigong, whatever, tai chi, contemplation, contemplative prayer. We know that if you calm the addict down, you optimize the neuroplasticity. If they're in fight flight, their brain can't heal. You get them calm, the brain can heal. In this age of COVID, what that seems to be looking like is the value of quality sober living, to my way of thinking, is actually going up. In some ways, I think it might be rising above primary treatment. Because in quality sober living, you're in an intimate, more family situation. You can relax, you can build relationships, you can have a rhythm, and you can have continuity of care. You can do things that you can't really do in 30-day programs. So your brain relaxes, you get into what's called the limbic part of the brain, which is the same part of the brain that's implicated in addiction. And this is the part of the brain where we've identified compassion and empathy through these things called spindle cells and mirror neurons. And we know that when people are relaxed and when they feel safe and secure, those parts of the brain actually light up. What this means is compassion, empathy, love, if you will, emerges when the environment is conducive to compassion, empathy, and love. Duh, right? So we need to create environments where that can happen. It's imperative that we create environments where that can happen. You know, it's not so very long ago that everything was therapeutic community, which looked like what? Yeah, my foot in your ass, rules all the time, consequences for breaking rules. You took somebody who was already in the stress response and you put them through basic training in the Marines, and you wonder why that didn't happen. Now, does this mean that we have to be total pushovers? Not at all. Not at all. The whole business with accountability and consequences, it still has to be there. But you can do that with a stick, or you can do that with honey. And I think at RRTC, we're about doing that with honey. So structurally, there's these problems, okay? Here's a big problem. Just for example, yoga. Okay, yoga is recognized by the National Institutes of Health as being a complementary form of medicine. That's the National Institutes of Health. So they're backed with all these studies that validate it's great for stress, sleep, heart disease, optimizes your healing post-operatively. It does all these wonderful things for you. But guess what? Insurance companies won't reimburse for that. Meditation, contemplation, you know, most of us in recovery, we fumble around with that. We sit in these groups, we get agitated, we're supposed to be meditating. The truth of the matter is you need instruction. You need instruction from people that are qualified to teach you how to do it. It's not something you learn off of an app or off of YouTube. It's an ancient science, it's an ancient technology, if you will. But once again, the insurance companies won't reimburse for that, even though that is probably more validated as a treatment modality than yoga. So here's my point. We know what they need. Insurance isn't going to pay for it. Is it going to be on us to deliver it? Or are we going to be caught up in these calculations? You know what I'm saying? Are we going to have treatment centers step up and do the informed thing and the right thing, even though they're not going to get reimbursed for it? It looks like we're not going to, but I'm proud to say that where we're working, we are going to. Okay? So the other thing is if what comes out of this is the opposite of addiction is connection, okay? So we have other false binaries. We have a false binary that says you either lock drug addicts up or you give them treatment. And so a lot of people that are more progressive or liberal, they're like, treatment dollars, treatment dollars, treatment dollars, treatment dollars. And the truth of the matter is the way this is right now, we can't treat our way out of this. Nor can we incarcerate our way out of this. We have tried both, okay? So that's a false binary because there's a third thing that's being left out that's the bigger thing, and that's called community. If the opposite of addiction is not abstinence, it's connection, then everything is about building community. And building community means that we have to start partnering with people that are not part of the game, meaning they're not part of the insurance game. We have to partner with people and build communities that there's no real financial gain to be made, okay? So I'm happy that I'm part of something called, I teach at a place called the Alcyon Center. It's up in Mount Desert Island in Maine. It's a retreat center. And it's where you go practice a lot of this contemplative stuff. You get out in nature. It's really amazing. And the women who own it, my friends Catherine and Joan, they don't make a lot of money. And they create ways that people can go to it with limited means, scholarships and such. But probably 70% of the people that go there now are people in the first or second year of recovery. And they come out of there after a weekend retreat and they've experienced more relief from that stress response than maybe they ever have in their lives. And they come out of there with certain techniques to be able to do that on their own, okay? And we're gonna build a relationship with them. We do have a relationship with them, but we're gonna build it and we're gonna make it so a lot of our graduates and our staff can go to this place. And there's no insurance involved. Another thing that a lot of you might know about is that in the big book, and I am an old 12-stepper, but I think the steps need to be recontextualized. But if you find in the big book, there's a really famous guy by the name of Carl Jung, one of the most famous psychologists ever. And Carl Jung, he really informs what we do in the steps, whether you know it or not. What he would call a fourth step it's shadow work. Fourth step is dealing with your shadow. So when you write a fourth step, you're writing about all the things that you don't like about yourself, the things that you would rather not see, the things that you would hide from other people. And it's hard work. Anybody who's written the fourth step knows this. It's hard work, and all the more reason why you need a kind, supportive environment to do it in. But these guys, these Jungian people, if you will, they're the experts on the shadow. So they can take that kind of stuff to a much deeper level than your average 12-stepper can. Well, right here in Boston is the Boston Jung Institute. Now, you would have thought that the 12-step world and the Jungian world would have been partnering up for decades now, given that Carl Jung's writing the big book and there's this famous correspondence between Bill Wilson and Carl Jung. It's never happened. So we're happy to say that we're going to be partnering with them in the sense that we're going to take interns from there and show them the 12-step world and the recovery world, and then we're going to be sending our graduates to their analyst in training for cheap sliding fee or even free analysis when they get out. Once again, completely outside of the insurance game. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And if you go over in Europe, you can see that a bunch of this stuff is being implemented. So over here, we confuse language something terrible. You talk to some people and they will say that harm reduction is actually a form of treatment. Sorry, harm reduction is harm reduction. It's not treatment. In Europe, they don't make that mistake. So if you go over to Europe, you go to Portugal, they don't fool around with Suboxone. They have injection sites where people bang heroin. And they go and they get their dose. They understand that the dose may even go up. You know, addicts being addicts, they're fine with that. But what they do that we don't do is they have wraparound services. So you need a bed, you need a meal, you need a shower. Hell, you're interested in treatment. You want a job. You want to go into some job training or college. They do all of that. And what have they seen with the rate of IV drug abuse in Portugal? They actually watch it go down. And they say that the people will get in there and they're still doing the heroin, but now they've got a job, now they've got a little apartment, maybe they want to date the woman at work, maybe they want to feel better about themselves, so they go back and they say, I want to come down off it. We're unwilling to do that in this country, okay? So down on Mass Avenue or on Preble Street, you will see people that are, you know what they are, but they can get on Suboxone and they can get on the methadone. The state will pay for that, but the state will not pay for the apartment or the job training, because we're not willing to do that. And as far as I'm concerned, if I was homeless, and I'm a veteran of the methadone program, if I was homeless on methadone, you've probably driven me in deeper despair than I was without the methadone. So these are like really hard conversations that we have to have. We are not going to have enlightened public policy that says, let's start imitating Portugal. And that's because we have, and I am not a communist, we have a private healthcare system that's about making profits. It's not about cutting costs for everybody. Okay, so the insurance game, you put somebody on some sort of drug for a year, they don't care. They don't care that they have to pay because they're just going to raise everyone else's premium next year. House always wins. You go over in Europe and they're like, how can we drive the cost of healthcare down for everybody? Maybe it's worth our while to spend a little bit of money on housing for people in recovery, job training programs. So my point in saying all that is not to drive this narrative darker. It's to say that if we're going to change this thing, we got to start thinking out of the box, even those of us who work within the system. Does that make sense? We need to be trauma savvy. We don't need to be trauma sensitive, okay? I feel like, and believe me, I can quote the big book. I doubt you can find anybody who can quote the big book better than me or has had more reps in it. It saved my life. But I do feel that the narrative that I was brought up to tell about myself is a false narrative. It's a very male narrative. It's a very pull yourself up by the bootstraps and man up narrative. And the narrative looks like this. Come from a good family. Parents were married for 50 years. Expectation was that I would go to college, marry a nice girl, yada, yada, yada. But somewhere around 6th grade, I got really attracted to these bad boys and I started smoking weed, made this kind of perverse decision, and down the road I went. That's not the truth. And yet, my 12-step world reinforced that. Here's the truth. Everything I said about my parents is true to some extent. But my mother suffered a major mental illness that was never diagnosed. She was pretty crazy. I grew up in a really racially charged environment where the threat of violence or actual violence was there every day. I experienced sexual abuse. I grew up in a hypersexualized world. And by the time I'm looking at my friends' big brothers, you know, this is back with Rolling Stones and hippie girls and smoking weed, I'm like, sign my ass up. And of course, when I first started using, what did I get? I got tremendous relief. And that's how everybody in this room who's an addict can speak, that you didn't start using because you were perverse and made a selfish decision. You started using because you got relief from something. And we need to start telling our stories truthfully, because that story I just told you about myself, I am the product of that environment, okay? If connection is the opposite of addiction, then that environment needs to change. You see, that's where prevention happens. We're now at a point where we can say, you do not, you know what, like kids, for instance, we know now that if you grow up in a highly stressed environment, the cortisol and all that crap that happens to your brain, you cannot learn when you go to school. So we often hear people say this is attention-seeking behavior. Nope, that's connection-seeking behavior. The child has no connection at home. So when he comes to school, it's more stable and sane there, and he's thirsting to make contact with somebody. Iceland is another country that's figuring this out. Of course, they have a population smaller than Vermont, so. But they started seeing this spike in substance abuse amongst young people, and here's the solution they came up with. They created a voucher system, and every family in the country who had a kid who was in middle school or high school got a voucher. and the voucher could be used for an after-school program in sports or arts. And guess what happened? The rate of substance abuse just plummeted right away. What do we cut immediately in schools? First arts and then sports. They didn't come at the kids with just say no. They didn't put a brain in a frying pan, or take them into a prison and terrify them. They just gave young people fun and meaningful things to do with other young people. Not kids sitting in basements playing World of Warcraft with somebody in London. Yeah? So my point here is that we know what to do. We know what to do. Shifting this is not something that could happen very quickly or easily. You know, Bruce Alexander does not believe it's going to happen in your grandchildren's lifetime. But if we do our work, we might create a chain, a link that somebody 100 years from now can claim victory. But, you know, I'll just finish with this. Some of you are acquainted with this model of addiction we use that says, you know, there's the body. Once you start using, you can't stop. And then there's the emotions, restless, irritable, and discontent. You're miserable when you're sober. And then there's the mental obsession. I can't stop thinking about drugs when I'm sober. Now let's look at the way the system works with that model. For using, we use behaviorism. The goal is to get the client to stop using. No distinction is made between recovery and sobriety. So we hear people say things like good sobriety. If you unpack that, there's no such thing as good sobriety. If you're really an addict and you're sober, you're miserable. Fair enough? There's recovery and sobriety. So we have treatment centers, or even within the 12-step world, you have people saying, you know, dude hasn't used for 4 years, what a wonderful success. But then we start looking a little more closely, and he's been referred to anger management for putting the knuckles to his wife, and he's under psychiatric care, and he's considering going on disability, which is rising all the time, by the way. That's not good sobriety. That's just working with the behavior. Then when you get on the mind side, we come at them with this cognition, cognitive behavioral therapy. Think through the drink, play the tape through, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. I'm here to tell you, in 26 years, I have never gone to a meeting and saw somebody raise their hand and say, I really wanted to get loaded today, but then I thought of the disappointment on my wife's face and the thought went away. I haven't seen that once. And yet they continually teach this in the graduate schools. Think your way through drink. I can't think my way through a drink. Back in the day, you would see these guys around, the white knuckling guys who they could get hit with that obsession and they wouldn't drink and just don't, you know, just go to meetings and ask for help kind of guys. My experience is those guys are actually beginning to vanish. You may still see a few alcoholics like that. You never see white knuckling drug addicts. You used to. And once again, that's because the drugs are so strong and the withdrawal syndromes are so powerful that they can't handle it. They just use. The temptation's too great. And then finally, the middle one, the restless, irritable, and discontent, all we do with that one is we throw psych meds at it. That's all we do. So none of that's really recovery because you're not really dealing with the demons that made you a drug addict to begin with. You're simply treating symptoms, right? So we need to have these hard conversations. I mean, I'm at the point where I feel like writing a tell-all book. I couldn't work in this field if I did it, though. But, you know, these are the conversations that we sometimes have in our cars or in the private moments thinking to ourselves. And it's time we start talking, and it's time we start really trying to implement some things that think out of the box, because the box, not working. And by the way, I am a proponent of harm reduction. I have no problem with Matt. I do have a problem with just Matt. No other supports, no other building a life for these people. I actually think we would see the same thing here. We would see people use it as a short to medium term thing if we could get them integrated. I think I have every confidence that we could do that. but we're driving people into despair. And I think as providers, we're also tasting that despair, aren't we? Last 4 years, I don't know how many times I was talking to somebody on Friday and found out they were dead on Tuesday. It wasn't like that first 10 or 15 years of my recovery. So, Rockland Recovery, we're going to try to tap into resources that are not conventional, that are designed to build community, get people out of the stress response, and we very much want to build community with the rest of you. But you just need to know what we're about. All right. Thank you much.